Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The sun hammered down on Copper Ridge like a blacksmith's anvil, turning the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe. Marlowe Cade stood in the middle of Main Street, her dress torn at the shoulder, dirt streaked across her face like war paint she never asked for. Blood trickled from her split lip where Harlan Voss had backhanded her 3 minutes ago. The entire town watched from behind their windows and porches, eyes wide but mouths shut, because nobody crossed Harlan Voss. He owned the bank, the saloon, and half the land between here and the mountains. Marlowe's hands shook as she clutched a leather satchel to her chest, the only thing standing between her 2 daughters and starvation. Harlan had just foreclosed on her late husband's ranch, and when she'd begged for 1 more week, he'd laughed and struck her down in front of everyone. Now she lay there in the dust, tasting copper and shame. "Stay down where you belong, widow," Harlan spat, adjusting his silver bill tie. His boots were so polished they caught the sunlight like mirrors, reflecting everything Marlowe had lost. Behind him, his son Carter smirked, 22 years old and cruel as a rattlesnake with nothing to prove except that he was his father's boy. Marlowe tried to push herself up, her palms grinding into the hot dirt, but her arms gave out. The satchel spilled open, and the last of her husband's personal effects scattered across the street. A pocket watch, a faded photograph of their wedding day, a small wooden horse he'd carved for their oldest daughter. The townspeople looked away. Shame was contagious in Copper Ridge, and nobody wanted to catch it. Marlowe's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed, not here, not in front of these vultures. Then a shadow fell across her face, blocking out the merciless sun. She looked up, expecting another boot or another insult. Instead, she saw a man she didn't recognize, tall and lean with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of winter smoke. He wore a simple brown duster, trail-worn and dust-covered, and a black hat tilted low over his brow. A little girl stood beside him, maybe 7 years old, with braids the color of wheat and a cloth doll tucked under one arm. The man knelt down slowly, his knees cracking slightly, and began gathering Marlowe's scattered belongings with careful, deliberate hands. His fingers were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd known hard work and harder choices. The little girl knelt too, picking up the wooden horse with reverent care, as if it were made of gold instead of pine. "Don't you dare help me," Marlowe hissed through clenched teeth, her pride flaring like a match struck in darkness. She couldn't bear kindness right now, not from a stranger, not when she'd just been humiliated in front of everyone she'd ever known. The man didn't stop. He placed the pocket watch back in the satchel, then the photograph, smoothing out a crease with his thumb. His movements were unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world, as if Harlan Voss and his son weren't standing 10 feet away with murder in their eyes. The little girl handed Marlowe the wooden horse, and their eyes met. The child's gaze was steady and knowing, too old for such a young face, like she'd seen her own share of dust and defiance. Marlowe's throat tightened. The stranger looked up at her then, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the smallest, saddest smile she'd ever seen. "Too late for that, dear," he said quietly, his voice rough as creek gravel but somehow gentle. He stood and offered her his hand, palm up, waiting. Behind him, Harlan Voss took a step forward, his face darkening like a thunderhead rolling in off the plains. Carter's hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. The stranger didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their existence at all. His gray eyes stayed locked on Marlowe's, steady as a compass needle pointing north. In that moment, she had a choice: take his hand and accept whatever came next, or stay in the dirt where Harlan wanted her. Her daughters' faces flashed through her mind. Nessa, 9 years old with her father's stubborn chin, and little Briar, only 5, who still cried for her daddy every night. Marlowe reached up and took the stranger's hand. His grip was strong and sure, and he pulled her to her feet like she weighed nothing at all. The town held its breath. 3 days earlier, Marlowe had stood in the kitchen of the ranch house her husband Dalton built with his own hands, staring at the foreclosure notice Harlan's men had nailed to her door. The paper was crisp and official, stamped with the territorial seal, giving her 72 hours to vacate the property or face forced removal. Dalton had been dead for 8 months, kicked in the chest by a spooked horse and gone before the doctor could even arrive from town. He'd left her with 2 daughters, 40 acres of scrubland, a small herd of cattle she couldn't manage alone, and debts she didn't know existed until the letters started arriving. Harlan had apparently loaned Dalton money 2 years ago to expand the herd, money Dalton never mentioned, and now Harlan wanted it back with interest that had compounded like a cancer. The numbers on the paper might as well have been written in a foreign language. All Marlowe knew was that she was about to lose everything. Nessa had found her mother crying at the kitchen table that night, tears dripping onto the foreclosure notice and smearing the ink. "Mama, why are you sad?" she'd asked, crawling into Marlowe's lap even though she was getting too big for it, all elbows and knees and fierce loyalty. Marlowe had tried to smile, tried to lie, but the words stuck in her throat like fishhooks. How do you tell your daughter that the home she was born in, the land where her father was buried under the cottonwood tree, was about to belong to a man who'd smiled while delivering the news? Briar had wandered in too, dragging her blanket, thumb in her mouth, sensing the wrongness in the air the way children do. Marlowe had held them both and made promises she had no idea how to keep. "We'll be okay," she'd whispered into their hair. "Mama will figure something out." But she had no plan, no family to turn to, no skills beyond keeping a house and raising children in a world that valued neither. The next morning, she dressed in her only good dress, dark blue calico with tiny white flowers, the one she'd worn to church back when she still believed God was listening, and walked the 3 miles into Copper Ridge. The town was small and mean, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did and judged you for it besides. False-fronted buildings lined Main Street, their paint peeling in the relentless sun, and the smell of horse manure and wood smoke hung in the air like a permanent fog. Marlowe had gone to the bank first, hoping to reason with Harlan, to beg for an extension or renegotiate the terms. The bank clerk, a pinched-faced man named Tobias who'd gone to school with Dalton, wouldn't even let her past the front desk. "Mr. Voss doesn't renegotiate with widows," he'd said, not unkindly but not kindly either, just stating facts like he was reading from a ledger. "You had your notice. Best start packing." She tried the general store next, asking old Samuel Greer if he needed help, if she could work for wages to start paying down the debt. Samuel had looked at her with something like pity and something like fear, and shaken his head. "Can't cross Harlan, Marlowe. He owns my supplier contracts. I hire you, he shuts me down. I got a family too." It was the same story at the seamstress shop, the livery stable, even the church. Reverend Michaels had prayed with her, his papery hands folded over hers, but when she asked if the church could loan her money, he'd looked at his shoes and mumbled something about the offering plate being lighter these days. Nobody would help. Nobody could afford to. Harlan Voss had this town wrapped around his finger like a ring, and everyone knew that crossing him meant ruin. By the time Marlowe walked back out onto Main Street that afternoon, the sun was setting and her hope was a guttered candle. That's when she'd seen him for the first time, the stranger with the gray eyes. He'd been standing outside the saloon, one boot propped against the hitching post, watching the street with an expression that gave nothing away. The little girl was with him, sitting on the edge of the wooden sidewalk, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Something about the way he stood, loose-limbed but alert, reminded Marlowe of a wolf she'd once seen on the edge of their property, neither aggressive nor afraid, just aware of everything around it. Their eyes had met across the dusty street for just a moment, and she'd felt a strange jolt of recognition, though she was certain she'd never seen him before. Then Harlan's carriage had rolled past, breaking the line of sight, and when it passed, the stranger was walking away, the little girl's hand in his, heading toward the edge of town. Marlowe had thought nothing more of it. Copper Ridge saw drifters all the time, men running from something or toward something, never staying long enough to matter. She'd gone home, fed her daughters the last of the beans and cornbread, and lain awake all night trying to figure out how to save them from the street. Gideon Thorne hadn't planned on stopping in Copper Ridge. He and his daughter Ivy had been riding the circuit for 2 years now, ever since the fever took his wife Clara and left him with a 7-year-old who barely spoke anymore and a grief so heavy it felt like stones in his pockets. They moved from town to town, never staying more than a week, picking up work where they could, mending fences, breaking horses, sometimes playing piano in saloons for spare coin and free meals. Gideon had been a schoolteacher once, back in St. Louis, with a tidy house and a wife who sang while she cooked and a future that looked like something you could hold in your hands. Then Clara got sick, the kind of sick that hollows you out from the inside, and the doctors with their leeches and tonics couldn't do a damn thing except take his money and offer condolences. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, with lilacs blooming outside the window and Ivy crying so hard she couldn't catch her breath. After the funeral, Gideon had packed everything they owned into 2 saddlebags, sold the house for half what it was worth, and headed west with no destination in mind. Ivy hadn't spoken a full sentence since. She communicated in nods and headshakes, in drawings she made in the dirt or on scraps of paper, in the way she gripped his hand when she was scared. The doctors in 3 different territories had examined her and found nothing physically wrong. Her voice worked fine when she screamed from nightmares, but something inside her had locked up tight as a bank vault, and Gideon didn't know how to pick that particular lock. So they drifted, and he took whatever work came, and he tried not to think about the man he used to be, the one who believed in books and progress and the basic goodness of people. That man was dead and buried alongside Clara. They'd arrived in Copper Ridge on a Tuesday evening, the irony of which wasn't lost on Gideon, and taken a room above the saloon for 50 cents a night. The room was barely big enough for the narrow bed they shared, with walls so thin you could hear every cough and curse from the neighboring rooms, but it was shelter and that was enough. Gideon had gone downstairs to see about work, and the saloon keeper, a broad-shouldered woman named Della with graying hair and shrewd eyes, had looked him up and down like she was appraising livestock. "You play piano?" she'd asked, nodding toward the battered upright in the corner. Gideon had nodded. "Then you got work. 6 to midnight, 6 nights a week. $1 a night plus whatever folks throw in the jar. You drink on your own time and your own dime, and if you start trouble, you're out. We clear." They were clear. That first night, Gideon had played every song he knew, hymns and ballads, dance tunes and drinking songs, his fingers remembering what his heart tried to forget. Ivy had sat beside him on the bench, her cloth doll in her lap, watching his hands move across the keys with solemn attention. Between songs, Gideon had watched the room, a habit born from 2 years of staying alive in places that didn't always welcome strangers. That's when he'd first noticed the tension in the air, the way conversations dropped to whispers when a particular man walked in. Harlan Voss. Gideon knew the type immediately, small-town king with too much power and not enough conscience, the kind of man who measured his worth by how many people feared him. Harlan had sat at his usual table, surrounded by lackeys and sycophants, drinking expensive whiskey while everyone else made do with rotgut. His son Carter had been there too, young and mean, learning cruelty at his father's knee. The next day, Gideon had taken Ivy for a walk around town, trying to give her something besides saloon walls to look at. That's when he'd seen Marlowe for the first time, standing outside the bank with her shoulders slumped and her face pale, defeat written in every line of her body. Something about her struck him hard and sudden, like a memory he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way she held herself, proud even in desperation, or the way she squared her shoulders before walking away from whatever bad news she'd just received. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just recognized another person who'd lost everything and was still trying to figure out how to keep breathing. Ivy had tugged his hand, pointing at Marlowe, and when Gideon looked down, his daughter was staring at the woman with unusual intensity. "What is it, sweetheart?" he'd asked, but Ivy just shook her head and held his hand tighter. They'd watched Marlowe disappear down the street, and Gideon had felt something shift in his chest, some small crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. He'd told himself it was nothing, that they'd be gone from this town in a week anyway, that other people's troubles weren't his concern. He'd been lying. Marlowe's ranch sat 3 miles west of town, accessible by a rutted wagon road that turned to mud in spring and dust in summer. The house was small but sturdy, built from local timber and river stone, with a covered porch where Dalton used to sit in the evenings, smoking his pipe and watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Behind the house stood a barn that badly needed new shingles, a chicken coop where 6 hens scratched out a living, and a well that Dalton had dug with his own hands, 40 feet down to cold, clean water. The land itself was marginal grazing at best, scrubby grass and sagebrush dotted with the occasional cottonwood, but Dalton had loved it with the passion of a man who'd grown up with nothing and finally owned something. Now it was slipping through Marlowe's fingers like that well water, and she couldn't hold on no matter how tight she gripped. The morning after her humiliation in town, after the stranger had helped her to her feet and walked away without asking for thanks or explanation, Marlowe stood in her kitchen trying to figure out what to feed her daughters for breakfast. The cupboard was down to flour, a bit of lard, and half a jar of preserves. The chickens had stopped laying, they could sense the tension, or maybe they were just old, and the cow had dried up 2 months ago. She'd sold off most of the cattle to pay other debts, keeping back just 3 head that weren't worth the hassle of driving to market. Nessa and Briar sat at the table, quiet in the way children get when they know something's wrong but don't understand what. Marlowe made flapjacks with water instead of milk, thin and tasteless, and watched her daughters eat without complaining. Nessa cut Briar's flapjack into small pieces without being asked, taking care of her little sister the way she'd been doing more and more lately. It broke Marlowe's heart. After breakfast, Marlowe sent the girls outside to play and sat down at Dalton's old desk to go through the papers one more time, hoping she'd somehow miss something, some clause or loophole or miracle. The loan documents were straightforward and brutal. Dalton had borrowed $500 from Harlan Voss 2 years ago, using the ranch as collateral with terms that called for monthly payments of $25 plus interest. For the first year, Dalton had managed the payments, though Marlowe never knew how tight things had been. After he died, she'd kept up for 3 months using the money from selling the cattle, but then the well had needed repairs and Briar had gotten sick and the payment stopped. Now the debt had ballooned to nearly $800 with penalties and interest, an impossible sum. Harlan could have worked with her, could have extended the terms or reduced the interest, but he didn't want payments. He wanted the land. The ranch bordered one of his properties, and owning it would give him control of the only reliable water source for miles. It had never been about money. It had been about power. Marlowe heard horses approaching and looked out the window to see 3 riders coming up the road, dust rising behind them like smoke signals. She recognized them immediately, Harlan's men, hired thugs who did the dirty work he didn't want to soil his own hands with. The lead rider was a man named Jessup, tall and raw-boned with a face like an axe blade, known for being quick with his fists and quicker with his gun. Marlowe's pulse hammered in her throat. She stepped onto the porch just as they reined up in front of the house. Jessup tipped his hat with mock courtesy, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Mrs. Cade. Just here to remind you that your time's up tomorrow at noon. Mr. Voss expects the property to be vacated and cleaned out. You can leave the furniture, he's got no use for your leavings." His companions snickered. Nessa and Briar had stopped playing and stood frozen by the barn, watching with wide eyes. "I'm aware of the deadline," Marlowe said, forcing her voice to stay steady even though her hands were shaking. "I'll be gone by noon." Jessup's smile widened. "See that you are. Would be a shame if we had to remove you ourselves. Might get rough, and we wouldn't want the little ones to see that." It was a threat barely disguised as concern, and they both knew it. Marlowe's vision went red at the edges, rage boiling up from some deep place she didn't know she had. These men, these animals, threatening her children on her own land, the land her husband died trying to hold on to. She opened her mouth to say something she'd probably regret when she heard the sound of another horse approaching from the direction of town. They all turned to look. The rider came into view slowly, unhurried, a man on a buckskin gelding with a little girl riding in front of him. Even from a distance, Marlowe recognized the gray eyes and the worn duster. The stranger, Gideon Thorne. He rode up to the house and stopped, surveying the scene with a glance that took in everything and revealed nothing. Ivy clutched her doll and stared at Jessup and his men with the same solemn intensity she'd shown in town. Jessup's hand drifted toward his pistol. "This ain't your business, friend. Suggest you ride on." Gideon looked at Marlowe, and something passed between them, some wordless question and answer. Then he dismounted slowly, lifting Ivy down with gentle hands, and turned to face Jessup with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think I'll stay." The air between the men crackled like lightning about to strike, that terrible moment of silence before the storm breaks. Jessup sat taller in his saddle, his hands still hovering near his gun, calculating odds the way predators do when they encounter something unexpected. His two companions flanked him, both looking less certain now, their eyes flicking between Gideon and their leader, waiting for the signal that would turn this from words to violence. Gideon stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, but Marlowe could see the coiled tension in his shoulders, the way his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet. This was a man who'd been in situations like this before, maybe too many times. Ivy had moved to stand beside Nessa and Briar, the three girls forming their own small alliance near the barn, watching with the eerie stillness of children who understand that adults are about to do something terrible. "You're making a mistake," Jessup said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register men use when they're about to do violence and want you to know it's your fault. "This woman owes Mr. Voss money she can't pay. The law's on his side. You ain't got no claim here, no right to interfere." Gideon tilted his head slightly, as if considering this. "The law," he repeated, tasting the word like it was something bitter. "The law says a man can loan money at whatever interest rate he wants, then take everything a widow owns when her husband dies and she can't keep up? That the law you're talking about?" Jessup's face darkened. "The law says contracts are contracts. She signed the papers. Her problem she can't make good." Gideon nodded slowly. "And the law says you can threaten children to make sure their mother complies? That in the territorial code somewhere, or is that just Harlan Voss's personal interpretation?" Marlowe saw Jessup's jaw tighten, saw his fingers curl toward his gun. Before anyone could move, Gideon reached into his duster and pulled out a leather wallet, old and worn. He opened it and extracted a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and travel. "I'm a licensed attorney, admitted to the bar in Missouri and recognized throughout the territories. This contract Mrs. Cade signed? I'd bet my last dollar it violates usury laws. The interest rate Harlan charged is illegal by territorial statute. Which means the entire contract is void. Which means you and your friends are currently trespassing on Mrs. Cade's property." He refolded the paper with deliberate care and tucked it back into his wallet. "So I suggest you tell Mr. Voss that if he wants this land, he can take it up with the territorial judge when court convenes next month. Until then, this property remains in Mrs. Cade's possession. Are we clear?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jessup stared at Gideon like he'd just sprouted a second head, his certainty cracking like thin ice. Nobody in Copper Ridge stood up to Harlan Voss. Nobody challenged him on legal ground or any other ground and lived to tell about it. But here was this drifter, this nobody from nowhere, quoting territorial law and threatening court proceedings with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. Jessup looked at his companions, saw his own uncertainty reflected in their faces, and made the calculation that Marlowe had seen predators make before: fight now and risk losing, or retreat and regroup. "Mr. Voss ain't gonna like this," Jessup said finally, but the threat in his voice had lost its edge. "Mr. Voss can bring his concerns to me directly," Gideon replied. "I'll be staying here at the ranch for the foreseeable future. He knows where to find me." That last part was news to Marlowe, and from the slight widening of Jessup's eyes, it was news that changed everything. Jessup wheeled his horse around without another word, and his companions followed suit, the three of them galloping back toward town in a cloud of dust and wounded pride. Marlowe watched them go, her heart still hammering, unable to quite believe what had just happened. When she turned back to Gideon, he was kneeling beside Ivy, checking to make sure she was all right, his big scarred hands gentle on his daughter's shoulders. Ivy nodded in response to some unspoken question, then walked over to where Nessa and Briar still stood by the barn. The three girls looked at each other for a long moment, then Ivy reached into her pocket and pulled out 3 smooth river stones, giving one to each of the other girls. Some kind of gift or talisman, a child's way of saying we're in this together. Nessa took hers solemnly, and Briar clutched hers to her chest like it was made of gold. Gideon stood and faced Marlowe, and she saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, the weight of whatever battles he'd fought before this one. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice rough with emotions she couldn't name. He shrugged, a small movement that somehow carried a world of meaning. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." And Marlowe realized with a jolt that ran through her like electricity that everything was about to change, that this stranger had just drawn a line in the dust that Harlan Voss wouldn't be able to ignore, and that she and her daughters were now standing on one side of a war they hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. She should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in 8 months, she felt something that might have been hope. That night, Marlowe cooked the first real meal her family had eaten in weeks. Gideon had ridden back to town and returned with supplies: salt pork, beans, flour, coffee, even a small bag of peppermint sticks for the girls. He'd paid for it all with money Marlowe knew he probably couldn't spare, and when she tried to protest, he'd just shaken his head and started unloading the packhorse. Now the smell of frying pork filled the small kitchen, and the girls sat at the table with Ivy between them, showing her the wooden horse Dalton had carved. Ivy had her doll positioned so it could see the horse too, and though she still didn't speak, she smiled when Briar made clip-clop sounds and galloped the horse across the tablecloth. Gideon sat in Dalton's old chair by the window, drinking coffee and watching the road, always watching, and Marlowe felt something dangerous unfurling in her chest, not quite hope, not quite trust, but something warm and fragile that terrified her more than Harlan's threats. After dinner, Marlowe put the girls to bed in the small room they shared. The three of them crowded into one bed because they wanted Ivy close. She heard them whispering in the dark, Nessa's voice low and steady, Briar's higher and excited, and Ivy's silence somehow part of the conversation. When Marlowe came back to the kitchen, Gideon was still at the window, his coffee long cold. "You should get some sleep," she said. "I made up the spare room for you and Ivy." He turned to look at her, and the lamplight caught the gray in his eyes, turning them silver. "I need to tell you what's coming, Marlowe. What I started today." She sat down at the table, suddenly exhausted, and nodded for him to continue. Gideon set down his coffee cup and leaned back against the wall. "That contract Harlan has you on? I wasn't bluffing. It's illegal. The interest rate violates territorial usury statutes by almost 300%. Any territorial judge would void it in a heartbeat." "Then we take it to court," Marlowe said, feeling that dangerous warmth spread through her chest again. "We fight him legally." Gideon's expression went dark. "In theories. In practice? The nearest territorial judge is in Silver City, 80 miles north. Court convenes once every 6 months. The next session isn't for another 4 months. And even if we could get an emergency hearing, Harlan has lawyers, good ones, expensive ones, who'll tie this up in motions and continuances for years. Meanwhile, he'll make your life hell. Cut off your credit at the stores. Make sure nobody in town will hire you or trade with you. He'll isolate you until you have no choice but to give up." Marlowe felt the warmth in her chest turn to ice. "So what you're saying is we can't win?" Gideon shook his head. "I'm saying we can't win the way he wants us to fight. So we fight differently." "How?" Marlowe asked, and she heard the desperation in her own voice, hated herself for it. Gideon moved away from the window and sat across from her at the table, his hands folded, his gaze steady. "We make the ranch successful. Profitable. We get the cattle operation back up and running, repair the fences, maybe bring in some horses to break and sell. We show that you can make the payments, that you're not some helpless widow to be pushed aside. And we do it fast, before Harlan can react. He's used to people rolling over. He's not used to people fighting back with competence and success." Marlowe stared at him. "You're talking about months of work. I don't have months. I don't even have days." Gideon's mouth quirked in that small, sad smile. "You have me," he said simply. "And I was a rancher before I was a teacher before I was a drifter. My father ran cattle in Wyoming. I know the work. We can do this." Marlowe wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But she'd believed before, believed Dalton when he said the ranch would make them rich, believed the doctor when he said her husband might pull through, believed herself when she'd promised her daughters everything would be okay. Belief was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. "Why?" she asked, the question raw and honest. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could ride out of here tomorrow and never think about us again. So why risk Harlan's anger? Why risk your daughter's safety?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, looking at something Marlowe couldn't see. "Because 2 years ago," he said finally, his voice rough as sandpaper, "my wife was dying and I couldn't save her. I had money for doctors but they couldn't help. I had education but it was useless. I had everything except the one thing that mattered, which was more time. And after she died, I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to help someone who was drowning, I wouldn't walk away. I wouldn't be one of the people who looks the other way because it's easier." He met her eyes. "You were drowning in that street yesterday. I'm not walking away." The silence between them was heavy with everything they weren't saying, with grief and determination and the weight of impossible choices. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the cottonwoods, and the wind rattled the windows in their frames. Marlowe thought about Dalton, about the man she'd loved who'd died too young, and wondered if he would approve of this stranger living in his house, sleeping in his spare room, helping his widow fight his battles. Then she thought about Nessa and Briar, about the way they'd laughed tonight for the first time in months, and she knew that Dalton would understand. He'd loved his daughters more than pride, more than property, more than anything. He would have taken help from the devil himself if it meant keeping them safe. "Okay," Marlowe said quietly. "We fight." Gideon nodded, and something passed between them, some unspoken pact sealed not with words but with shared understanding. They were allies now, bound together by necessity and something else, something neither of them was ready to name. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, the first warning of a storm rolling in off the mountains. Inside, Marlowe Banks made coffee and they sat together planning their war against Harlan Voss, two broken people trying to build something whole from the wreckage of their lives. The storm came at midnight, hard and fast, turning the dust to mud and the world to water. But inside the ranch house, the lamps burned bright, and for the first time in a long time, Marlowe didn't feel alone. The days that followed had a rhythm that Marlowe had almost forgotten, the rhythm of purpose. She woke before dawn to find Gideon already up, coffee made, heading out to survey the property and figure out what needed fixing first. The list was long and brutal. Half the fence line was down, the barn roof leaked in 3 places, the water trough had a crack that wasted precious water, and the small herd of cattle had scattered to the far corners of the property, half wild from neglect. But Gideon moved through it all with methodical efficiency, teaching Marlowe as he went, showing her how to splice barbed wire and patch shingles and read the land for signs of water and good grazing. His hands were constantly busy, constantly fixing, and Marlowe found herself watching those hands more than she should, wondering about the life they'd built before loss had taken it all apart. Ivy attached herself to Nessa and Briar like she'd always been part of their family, the 3 of them becoming inseparable within days. They helped with the small tasks, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, pulling weeds from the kitchen garden that Marlowe had been too exhausted to tend. Ivy still didn't speak, but she communicated through gestures and expressions and the careful drawings she made in the dirt. One afternoon, Marlowe found a drawing scratched into the earth near the porch, 3 big figures and 3 small ones, standing in front of a house. A family. She'd stared at it for a long time, her throat tight, before the wind had blown dust across it and erased it like a secret too dangerous to keep. That night, she'd lain awake wondering what it meant, this silent girl's vision of what they were becoming, and whether hope was something you earned or something that simply happened when you stopped fighting it. By the end of the first week, Gideon had repaired the worst of the fence line and patched the barn roof. He worked from sunup to sundown, barely stopping to eat, driving himself with a focus that Marlowe recognized, the focus of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. She brought him water and food in the fields, and sometimes they'd stand together in the afternoon heat, not talking, just looking at what they'd accomplished. The ranch was starting to look like something again, starting to remember what it had been when Dalton was alive and everything still made sense. But Marlowe knew it wasn't enough. They needed to round up the scattered cattle, get them to market, bring in actual money. They needed to prove to Harlan, and to the territorial authorities, that this ranch was viable, that she deserved to keep it. "Tomorrow we go after the herd," Gideon said on Saturday evening, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his face lined with exhaustion. "There's maybe 20 head out there if we're lucky. We bring them in, get them fattened up, and drive them to Silver City next month. It's not enough to pay off Harlan, but it's enough to show the judge we're serious." Marlowe nodded, then hesitated. Gideon, I need to ask you something. He looked up, waiting. When Jessup and his men come back, and they will come back, are you prepared for that? I mean really prepared. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gray eyes, something old and cold. I spent 4 years in the war, Marlowe. Missouri border country, some of the ugliest fighting you never heard about. I've done things I'm not proud of, seen things I wish I could forget. I'm not looking for violence. But if it comes... He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. I know how to handle it. The certainty in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she had in months. Sunday, the only day Gideon allowed himself to rest, they all rode into town for church. Marlowe knew it was dangerous, knew that showing up with Gideon and Ivy would set tongues wagging and probably reach Harlan's ears within the hour. But she also knew that hiding sent the wrong message. It said she was ashamed, that she was doing something wrong. And she wasn't. She was fighting for her home, and if people didn't like that, they could choke on their judgment. The church was small and whitewashed, sitting at the north end of Main Street, its bell tower visible from anywhere in town. Reverend Michaels stood at the door greeting parishioners, and his smile faltered slightly when he saw Marlowe approaching with Gideon and the 3 girls. Mrs. Cade, he said carefully. Good to see you. And your guests? The question hung in the air like smoke. This is Mr. Thorne and his daughter Ivy, Marlowe said clearly, her voice carrying to the other families standing nearby. They're staying at the ranch, helping me get back on my feet. She met the Reverend's eyes, daring him to say something, anything, that would give her an excuse to turn around and leave. But Michaels was a politician as much as a preacher, and he simply nodded and gestured them inside. The church was already half full, families sitting in their usual pews, the air thick with the smell of Sunday clothes and judgment. Marlowe felt every eye on her as she walked down the aisle, felt the weight of their whispers even though they kept their voices low. She chose a pew near the back and sat down, Gideon beside her, the 3 girls between them. Across the aisle, she saw Martha Henderson lean over to whisper something to her husband, both of them staring. 2 rows up, the Greers turned around to look, their faces carefully neutral. And in the very front pew, in the spot reserved for the town's most important family, sat Harlan Voss and his son Carter, dressed in their Sunday finest, looking for all the world like respectable citizens. Harlan turned around slowly, his eyes finding Marlowe's across the crowded church. He smiled, and it was the smile of a snake that spotted a mouse with nowhere to run. Then his gaze shifted to Gideon, and the smile faded. Something passed between the 2 men, some wordless acknowledgement that this was no longer just about money or land. This was personal. Carter leaned over to whisper something to his father, his young face twisted with malice. But Harlan shook his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Gideon's. The Reverend began his sermon, something about forgiveness and loving thy neighbor, but Marlowe barely heard it. All she could think about was the way Harlan had looked at them, the calculation in his eyes, the certainty of a man who'd never lost a fight and didn't intend to start now. Beside her, Gideon sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, but she could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a stove. Ivy had fallen asleep against Nessa's shoulder, her cloth doll clutched tight, and Briar was drawing pictures in the margins of a hymnal with a stub of pencil someone had left in the pew. They looked like a family. They looked like something worth fighting for. After the service, as people filed out into the bright sunshine, Harlan made his move. He positioned himself on the church steps, blocking the exit, his bulk and his reputation creating a wall that nobody wanted to push through. When Marlowe and Gideon emerged with the girls, he tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Mrs. Cade. Mr. Thorne. Enjoying our little church? His voice was loud enough to carry to everyone still lingering nearby. Gideon stepped slightly in front of Marlowe, a subtle shift that put him between her and Harlan. It's a nice service. The Reverend talks a good game about neighborliness. I'm curious how much of it actually happens around here. Harlan's smile widened. Oh, we're very neighborly. Why, I've been extraordinarily patient with Mrs. Cade here, giving her extensions, working with her. It's not my fault she can't manage her affairs. The lie was so blatant, so shameless, that Marlowe felt her face flush with anger. But before she could speak, Gideon laughed, a short, sharp sound like a breaking branch. "Patient," Gideon repeated, his voice conversational but carrying an edge like a razor. "Is that what you call charging 300% over the legal interest rate? Because where I come from, we call that theft. But maybe you have different definitions out here." The crowd went silent. Nobody talked to Harlan Voss like that. Nobody lived to do it twice. Harlan's face darkened like a thundercloud, and Carter stepped forward, his hand moving toward his hip before his father caught his arm. "You're making accusations you can't back up, friend," Harlan said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register. "And in front of witnesses. That's slander. I could have you arrested." Gideon pulled the folded legal document from his pocket again, the one he'd shown Jessup. "I'm an attorney, Mr. Voss. I don't make accusations I can't back up. And every word I said is documented fact. You want to sue me for slander? Please do. It'll give me a chance to subpoena your books and show a judge exactly what you've been doing to widows and farmers in this county for the past decade." The silence stretched so thin Marlowe thought it might snap. Then Harlan smiled again, but this time there was no humor in it, just cold calculation. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Both of you. This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders who don't understand how things work. Accidents happen. People disappear. Would be a shame if something happened to those pretty little girls." It was a death threat, barely disguised, delivered on church steps in front of God and everyone. Marlowe felt ice flood her veins. But Gideon just tilted his head, and when he spoke, his voice was so soft that people had to lean in to hear it. "If anything, and I mean anything, happens to Marlowe or her daughters or my daughter, I will dedicate the rest of my life to destroying you. Not killing you. That would be too quick. I'll destroy your reputation, your business, your family name. I'll dig up every illegal deal you've ever made, every law you've broken, every person you've cheated, and I'll make sure it all becomes public record. And then I'll let the law handle you. Or if the law won't, I'll let the people whose lives you've ruined do it instead. Are we clear?" For the first time, Marlowe saw something like uncertainty flicker across Harlan's face. Then it was gone, replaced by rage. But he stepped aside, letting them pass, because whatever else Harlan Voss was, he was smart enough to recognize a man who meant every word. As they walked to their wagon, Marlowe realized she was shaking. Behind them, the church crowd had erupted into whispers, and she knew by nightfall the whole county would know about the confrontation. War had been declared in the open now, and there was no going back. 3 nights later, Marlowe woke to Gideon shaking her shoulder in the dark. "Get up," he whispered urgently. "Get the girls. Now." She was instantly awake, heart hammering, pulling on her dress over her nightgown. Through the window she could see orange light flickering in the distance. "Fire." "The barn," she gasped, but Gideon shook his head. "Not yet. But there are riders coming, maybe 6 or 7. They're not here for conversation." He pressed something cold and heavy into her hand, a pistol. "You know how to use this?" She nodded, remembering the lessons Dalton had insisted on, back when they'd first moved out here and coyotes had been the biggest threat. That world seemed like a lifetime ago. Gideon moved quickly through the house, his own pistol in hand, checking windows and doors. Marlowe went to the girls' room and found all 3 of them already awake, Ivy standing by the window, pointing at the approaching riders. "Come with me, babies," Marlowe said, trying to keep her voice calm even though terror was clawing at her throat. "We're going to play a game. We're going to hide in the root cellar until Mama and Mr. Thorne say it's safe." Nessa's eyes were huge in the darkness, but she nodded and took Briar's hand. Ivy grabbed her doll and followed without question. Marlowe led them to the kitchen, lifted the trapdoor in the floor, and helped them down the wooden ladder into the cool darkness below. "Don't make a sound," she whispered. "No matter what you hear. Promise me." 3 small voices promised in the dark. Marlowe closed the trapdoor and covered it with the rag rug, praying it would be enough. When she turned around, Gideon was at the window, watching the riders approach. They were moving slowly now, fanning out to surround the house, dark shapes against the starlit night. "How many?" Marlowe asked, moving to stand beside him. 7. Maybe 8. Hard to tell. He glanced at her, and in the faint moonlight his face was hard as stone. They're here to burn us out. Drive us off. Maybe worse. Marlowe's grip tightened on the pistol. Then we fight. Gideon nodded, something like approval flickering in his eyes. We fight. But smart. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target and no choice. Every shot tells them where we are. The riders stopped 50 yards from the house, still visible in the ambient light. One of them, Marlowe recognized Jessup's raw-boned silhouette, rode forward alone, holding a torch high. "Thorn," he shouted. "You got one chance to walk away from this. Leave now, take your brat with you, and nobody gets hurt. Stay and we burn you out. Your choice." Gideon didn't answer, didn't move. Jessup waited, then shrugged. "Your funeral." He wheeled his horse and galloped back to his companions. They conferred briefly, then 3 of them rode toward the barn, torches blazing. Marlowe started toward the door, but Gideon caught her arm. "Let them take the barn," he said quietly. "It's insured. The house isn't. We need to defend what matters most." The words made sense, but watching those torches sail through the air and land in the hay was like watching parts of her life burn away. Within minutes, the barn was fully engulfed, flames shooting 50 feet into the night sky, turning everything orange and hellish. The remaining riders used the fire as cover, moving closer to the house under the chaos of light and shadow. Marlowe saw one of them circling around to the back door, saw another heading for the east window. "Back door," she whispered to Gideon. He nodded and moved silently through the dark house, his steps sure despite the lack of light. Marlowe stayed at the front window, watching 2 riders dismount and approach the porch. One of them was Carter Voss. She realized with a jolt, Harlan had sent his own son to do this, to terrorize a widow and burn her home. The boy was barely past 20, playing at being a man by doing his father's dirty work. Carter tried the front door, found it barred, then raised his boot to kick it in. The wood splintered but held. He kicked again, and this time the door burst inward. Marlowe stepped out from behind the wall, raised her pistol with both hands the way Dalton had taught her, and aimed at his chest. "Don't move," she said, surprised by how steady her voice was. Carter froze, his eyes going wide. His companion, a man Marlowe didn't recognize, reached for his gun. "I wouldn't," Marlowe said, shifting her aim. "Drop your weapons and step back, or I swear to God I will shoot you both." Carter's face twisted with anger and humiliation. "You won't shoot. You're just a woman, you don't have the spine." Marlowe pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the doorframe an inch from Carter's head, the boom deafening in the enclosed space. Carter yelped and stumbled backward, and his companion threw his gun down and raised his hands. "Next one goes through your skull," Marlowe said, and meant it. Behind the house, she heard a shout, then a gunshot, then silence. Her heart lurched. "Gideon." But then she heard his voice, calm and cold. "Next one of you tries that back door, you'll get the same. I'm a patient man, but my patience just ran out." Another voice, unfamiliar. "You shot Danny. You killed him." "No," Gideon replied. "I shot the gun out of his hand. But I'm happy to adjust my aim if you'd prefer." Silence. Then the sound of boots running, horses being mounted in a panic. The riders were retreating, pulling back beyond the firelight. Carter scrambled to his feet and ran, leaving his gun behind, his face pale and terrified. Marlowe lowered her pistol, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. The barn was still burning, a massive torch against the night sky, but the house was safe. They were safe. Gideon appeared from the back of the house, his face smudged with soot, his eyes still hard. "You hit?" she asked. He shook his head. "You?" "No." They stared at each other for a moment, 2 people who just crossed a line they could never uncross. Then Gideon moved to the trap door and knocked twice, then once, then twice again, some prearranged signal. He lifted the rug and opened the door. "It's safe, girls. Come on up." 3 small faces appeared in the opening, pale and frightened but unhurt. Ivy climbed out first, then helped Briar up, while Nessa scrambled up on her own. They ran to Marlowe, wrapping themselves around her, and she held them tight, feeling their hearts racing against hers. Gideon lifted Ivy into his arms and walked to the window, watching the riders disappear into the darkness. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "Maybe not tonight, but soon. Harlan's not going to let this go." Marlowe looked at him over her daughters' heads. "Good," she said, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. "Let him come. We're not running." Outside, the barn collapsed in on itself with a roar of falling timber and a shower of sparks. But inside the house, 5 survivors stood together in the darkness, and Marlowe realized that something fundamental had changed. They weren't victims anymore. They were fighters. And they were done being afraid. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days after the burning, a weathered man named Dalton Kincaid, no relation to Marlowe's late husband, though the shared name felt like some kind of cosmic irony. He'd ridden in from Silver City on reports of violence and property destruction, and Marlowe watched from the porch as he surveyed the blackened remains of her barn, the scorched earth where the flames had spread before Gideon and some neighbors had beaten them back. Those neighbors had appeared just after dawn the morning after the attack: Samuel Greer from the general store, the Hendersons, even old Tobias from the bank. They'd come with buckets and shovels and shame on their faces, finally finding the courage to stand up now that someone else had gone first. They'd worked all day helping contain the fire and salvage what could be saved. Not much, as it turned out. But their presence meant something. Marshal Kincaid dismounted and approached the porch, his badge catching the morning sunlight. He was maybe 50, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "Mrs. Cade," he said, touching his hat brim, "I need to hear your account of what happened here." Marlowe told him everything. The riders, the threats, Carter Voss kicking in her door, the gunshots. She didn't embellish or editorialize, just laid out the facts like stones on a path. Kincaid listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. When she finished, he asked, "You can identify the men who did this?" "Carter Voss was one," Marlowe said clearly. "And Jessup, Harlan Voss's foreman. I didn't recognize all the others in the dark, but those 2 I'm certain of." Kincaid's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am. Harlan Voss is a prominent citizen." "Harlan Voss is a criminal," Gideon said, stepping out onto the porch. He'd been inside with the girls, keeping them occupied so they wouldn't have to relive the terror again. He loaned Mrs. Cade's husband money at an illegal interest rate, then tried to foreclose when she couldn't make payments that violated territorial usury laws. When we challenged him legally, he sent men to burn us out. I can provide documentation of all of it. He handed Kincaid a folder thick with papers, copies of the loan documents, calculations showing the interest rate violations, a timeline of Harlan's threats and intimidation. Kincaid flipped through them, his expression growing darker with each page. "You're an attorney?" he asked Gideon. "I am. Admitted to the bar in Missouri, licensed to practice throughout the territories." Kincaid closed the folder and looked at them both for a long moment. "You realize what you're asking me to do? Harlan Voss owns half this county. He has lawyers, connections, political influence. Even with this evidence, it'll be a hell of a fight." "I'm aware," Gideon said quietly. "But the law is the law, isn't it? Or does it only apply to people who can't afford to buy their way out of it?" Kincaid's jaw tightened, and for a moment Marlowe thought he might take offense. Then his shoulders slumped slightly, and he looked suddenly older. "You're right," he said. "And I'm tired of looking the other way because it's easier. I'll go talk to Harlan, get his side of the story. But fair warning, this is going to get uglier before it gets better. Men like Harlan don't go down easy." Gideon nodded. "We're ready for ugly. We've been living in it for a while now." Kincaid rode off toward town, and Marlowe felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. This was the moment. Either the law would work the way it was supposed to, or they'd learn that justice was just another commodity that only the rich could afford. 3 hours later, Kincaid came back, and he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a deputy and, surprisingly, Reverend Michaels. They dismounted together, and Marlowe could see from their faces that something significant had happened. "Mrs. Cade, Mr. Thorne," Kincaid said formally. "I've conducted interviews in town and examined the evidence. Based on what I've found, I'm issuing warrants for the arrest of Carter Voss, Jessup Mallory, and 4 other men for arson, trespassing with intent to harm, and attempted assault. I'm also opening an investigation into Harlan Voss's lending practices. Marlowe's knees went weak with relief. You believe us, she said, almost not daring to hope. I believe the evidence, Kincaid replied. And I have additional testimony. He gestured to Reverend Michaels. The Reverend came forward with information this morning. Michaels stepped forward, his face drawn with guilt and determination. I should have spoken up sooner, he said quietly. But I was afraid. Harlan Voss has controlled this town through fear for years. After the confrontation at church, I spent 3 days praying for guidance. Then I remembered something. 5 years ago, a farmer named Joseph Creek came to me with a similar story about Harlan's loans and illegal interest rates. Joseph fought back, tried to take it to court. A week later, his barn burned down. 2 weeks after that, he disappeared. They found his body in a ravine 3 months later. The official story was that he'd gotten drunk and fallen. But I've always known it was murder. The word hung in the air like smoke. I've kept records, Michaels continued. Names of people Harlan has ruined over the years. Families forced off their land. Businesses destroyed. All legal on paper, all theft in reality. I've been documenting it for years, telling myself I'd speak up when the time was right. Watching you stand up to him, Mrs. Cade, made me realize the time was never going to be right. I just had to find the courage. Marshal Kincaid looked at Marlowe and Gideon. With the Reverend's testimony and your documentation, we have enough to bring charges. It won't be quick and it won't be easy, but Harlan Voss is going to face justice. Marlowe felt tears burning her eyes, but she blinked them back. What about Carter and the others? I'm headed to arrest them now, Kincaid said. They'll be held in Silver City until trial. Harlan will lawyer up, try to get them released, but attempted arson is a serious charge. The territorial judge won't take it lightly. He paused. I need you both to testify when this goes to court. It could be dangerous. Harlan's not going to take this lying down. We'll testify, Gideon said, and Marlowe nodded. They'd come too far to back down now. After Kincaid and the Reverend left, Marlowe sat down on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. Gideon sat beside her, and they watched the sun move across the sky in silence. The girls were in the house, playing some game Ivy had invented involving the river stones and Briar's rag dolls. Their laughter drifted through the open window, a sound Marlowe had thought she might never hear again. We did it, she said softly. We actually did it. Gideon shook his head slightly. We started it. The real fight is still coming. The trial, the aftermath, rebuilding. Harlan's going to make this as difficult as possible. I know, Marlowe said. But for the first time since Dalton died, I believe we can win. Not just survive, but actually win. She turned to look at him, this stranger who'd become something more, something she didn't have words for yet. Thank you. For staying. For fighting. Gideon met her eyes, and something passed between them, something warm and fragile and terrifying. I told you before, he said quietly. I don't walk away. He reached over and took her hand, his scarred fingers wrapping around hers, and Marlowe felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. This wasn't the grief-numbed gratitude of a widow accepting help. This was something else, something that felt like the first day of spring after a killing winter. She squeezed his hand back, and they sat there together as the sun set, two broken people who'd found in each other the pieces they'd thought were lost forever. Inside the house, Ivy laughed. An actual laugh, high and clear and musical, the first sound beyond whimpers and breathing that had come from her throat in 2 years. Gideon's head snapped around, his eyes going wide. Through the window, they could see the 3 girls collapsed in giggles over something, Ivy's face lit with joy. Did she just? Marlowe whispered. Gideon nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face. Healing, Marlowe realized, didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments like this, in laughter breaking through silence, in hands held on porch steps, in the courage to keep fighting when giving up would be so much easier. The war with Harlan wasn't over. But sitting there with Gideon, listening to their daughters laugh together, Marlowe knew they'd already won the thing that mattered most. They'd found their way back to hope. 6 months later, Marlowe stood in the same spot in Copper Ridge where Harlan Voss had struck her down, but everything had changed. The territorial trial had lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses Reverend Michaels had convinced to come forward. Harlan's lawyers had fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming: years of illegal lending, intimidation, and in Joseph Creek's case, probable involvement in murder. The judge had ruled against Harlan on every count, voiding not just Marlowe's loan but 17 others across the county. Harlan Voss, the untouchable king of Copper Ridge, had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. His properties were being liquidated to pay restitution to his victims. Carter had gotten 2 years for the arson, and Jessup was serving 4. The empire Harlan had built on fear and manipulation had crumbled like a house made of cards. The ranch was thriving now. With the money from the restitution and the sale of cattle Gideon had helped her round up and fatten, Marlowe had rebuilt the barn, repaired the fences, and even hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavy work. The land was producing again, and more than that, it felt like a home instead of a burden. Nessa had started attending the small schoolhouse in town, where she was apparently impressing the teacher with her quick mind and quicker wit. Briar had finally stopped crying for her father every night, though she still visited his grave under the cottonwood tree to tell him about her day. And Ivy, sweet silent Ivy, was talking now. Not constantly, not the way some children chattered endlessly, but when she had something to say, the words came. Her first full sentence had been, "Can we stay here forever?" And Gideon had cried again, holding his daughter close and promising yes. Marlowe and Gideon had married in a quiet ceremony at the ranch last month, with just the Reverend and the girls present. It wasn't a marriage born from desperate need anymore, though that's how it had started. Somewhere between fighting fires and facing down killers and rebuilding a life from rubble, they'd fallen in love, real love, the kind that saw each other's scars and didn't flinch, that knew what it meant to lose everything and find the strength to build again. Gideon still had nightmares about the war, and Marlowe still woke sometimes reaching for Dalton, forgetting for a moment that he was gone. But they held each other through the dark times, and the light times were getting longer. They were building something together, something that honored the past without being trapped by it. Today was special for another reason. Marshal Kincaid had sent word that he wanted to meet them in town, said he had news. Marlowe and Gideon rode in together, the 3 girls in the back of the wagon, laughing about something only they understood. As they rolled down Main Street, people waved: Samuel Greer from the general store, Martha Henderson from her porch, even Tobias from the bank, who'd quit his job and started a small bookkeeping business helping farmers manage their accounts honestly. The town was different now, like a weight had been lifted. People walked taller, smiled easier. Fear was a powerful drug, and they were all learning to live without it. Kincaid met them outside the marshal's office, and his weathered face was split with a rare smile. "Got something for you," he said, handing Gideon an official-looking envelope. Gideon opened it, read quickly, and his eyebrows rose. "What is it?" Marlowe asked. "The territorial governor wants me to serve as the circuit judge for this district," Gideon said, sounding stunned. "Says they need attorneys willing to stand up to corruption, and my work on your case demonstrated integrity and courage." He looked at Kincaid. "Did you recommend me?" Kincaid shrugged. "I might have mentioned you in my report. Territory needs good judges. You interested?" Gideon looked at Marlowe, a question in his eyes. She thought about it for maybe 3 seconds. "You'd be good at it," she said. "You'd be fair. That's what people need, someone who treats the law like it matters, not like it's something to be bought and sold." Gideon nodded slowly, then smiled. "Then yes, I accept." The girls cheered from the wagon, though Marlowe suspected they didn't fully understand what it meant. But they understood that their father, because that's what Gideon was now, in every way that mattered, had been honored for doing the right thing. That lesson alone was worth more than gold. As they prepared to leave town, Marlowe took one last look at the spot where her life had changed. The dust where she'd fallen, where Gideon had knelt to help her, where she'd said, "Don't you dare help me," and he'd smiled and done it anyway. That moment felt like it belonged to different people, People who'd been smaller, more afraid, more broken. She wasn't that person anymore. She'd been forged in fire, literally, and come out stronger. She'd learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, that community mattered, that sometimes strangers became family and families could be built instead of just born into. She'd learned that Dalton's death didn't mean her story was over, just that it was changing chapters. And most of all, she'd learned that no matter how hard you fell, as long as you were willing to take a hand up, you could stand again. "Ready?" Gideon asked, offering his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. Marlowe looked at that hand, scarred, strong, steady, and smiled. "Too late to ask me that," she said, echoing his words from that first day with deliberate playfulness. "I'm already in." They rode home together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and purple. 3 girls laughed in the back of the wagon, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and safe and home. The ranch appeared on the horizon, the new barn bright against the darkening sky, smoke rising from the chimney where dinner would be waiting. It wasn't the life Marlowe had planned. It wasn't the one she'd had with Dalton. But it was hers, hard-won and real, built on courage and stubbornness and the kind of love that grows in the cracks between broken things. She'd told a stranger not to help her, and he'd done it anyway. She'd tried to face the world alone, and he'd refused to let her. And in the end, that refusal, that stubborn, wonderful, life-changing refusal, had saved them both. The wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk, carrying a family toward home. Behind them, Copper Ridge settled into evening, a town learning to heal. Ahead, the ranch waited, solid and real and theirs. And above it all, the first stars were beginning to appear, tiny points of light against the darkness, proof that even in the deepest night, there was always something to guide you home. Marlowe reached over and took Gideon's free hand, their fingers intertwining like they'd been made to fit together. "Thank you," she said quietly, not for the first time and not for the last. "For being too stubborn to walk away." Gideon squeezed her hand and smiled, that small, sad smile that wasn't quite so sad anymore. "Always," he said. "Too late for anything else, dear." And it was. It finally wonderfully was.